All right, good evening. So we've been running through a series on Guadalcanal, and anytime I go someplace to shoot a series of videos, whether it's on the World War One battlefields or World War Two or something like that, I end up finding myself shooting about 75% of what I had originally planned to film. So there's never enough time anywhere I go. So the same rings true of Guadalcanal. There were places that I wanted to go that we just didn't have time to. And another thing that I wanted to address in the Guadalcanal series that we just simply didn't have time to tackle was that running parallel to the Guadalcanal campaign was a campaign in New Guinea. And for Americans specifically, New Guinea is a campaign that is kind of shrouded in a little bit of mystery. And maybe I'm just kind of speaking for myself here, but I would say that more people know more about like the Guadalcanal campaign and some of the island hopping campaigns to follow than New Zealand, and especially the role of the Australians in the New Guinea campaign. I said New Zealand, I meant New Guinea. Well, on this Guadalcanal trip, we had a few historians who were with us. We talked to one the other day, Peter Williams, about his interviewing of Japanese veterans of the Second World War. And also with us was author and historian Phil Bradley. Now, Dave Holland is the expert on Guadalcanal. Paul Woodage would be the guy when it comes to Normandy. When it comes to New Guinea, I can't think of anybody who knows more about that campaign than Phil Bradley. So we're going to go ahead and bring him in here. All right, Phil, thank you for taking some time to join us here and talk some stuff on New Guinea.
Yeah, no problem, JD.
So right off the bat, for people who are watching, we're going to kind of give an overview of the campaign in New Guinea, kind of get a look at some things from an Australian perspective. And a lot of what we are going to cover can be found more in depth in Phil's book, Hell's Battlefield, to Kokoda and beyond. So this is one that you can put on your Amazon wish list. Phil has authored a number of books that are specific to New Guinea. Another one I have right here, which is D-Day New Guinea. A lot of outstanding work. But before we jump into the campaign, I'm kind of curious, like what is your background as far as your interest in the New Guinea campaign?
Yeah, I'll just start off, just explain New Guinea. So today it's the country is Papua New Guinea. So during the wartime, there are actually two parts of that country, which are Papua and New Guinea. So the New Guinea area is pretty much north of the Owen Stanley Ranges and some of the islands. And then Papua is the southern part of that area. And Papua is basically what we're going to be talking about today because it's the earlier campaigns occurred in Papua. So when we talk about New Guinea, it's Papua New Guinea is the country today. And as I said, we're going to be talking about the Papuan area of New Guinea. And in terms of how I got interested in it, my father fought up there during the war. So I was always had an interest as to what he got up to.
Oh, wow.
And I had some photos of him fighting up there, up in the mountains. And so I had the fortune, I guess, of getting a job in New Guinea in 1995. So I worked in New Guinea for 2 years in a town called Lae, which is the second biggest town in New Guinea. Okay. So it's actually in Papua New Guinea. So it's actually north of the Owen Stanley Range. And it's Lae I wrote the book about D-Day New Guinea, where they landed at Lae and captured the town. And my dad had fought up there, up in the mountains beyond Lae, a place called Shaggy Ridge. And so one of the first places I went to when I went to New Guinea was I took a vehicle up to the base of Shaggy Ridge, and then I climbed the ridge to see this amazing place. And then I wrote a book about it called The Battle of, I've written 2 books about it. The second one's called The Battle of Shaggy Ridge. So that was where I got my interest, and then it went from there. There were so many other battlefields that I got interested in. So I saw a lot of that, got interested in looking at wrecks from the war, the airplanes and stuff. And then in 2006, I walked the Kokoda Trail, or
Oh,
Kokoda
wow.
also called. And then I worked with a guy, mate of mine, Frank Taylor, who's done the Kokoda track about 150 times. And so I did a number of treks for him, led them across the track and back. Getting a bit old for that now, but again, that opened my eyes as to the fighting conditions, because there were battles across this Kokoda Trail, which we'll talk about today. So yeah, that's where my interest has come. And in recent times, the last 3 years, I've taken Army officer groups up to New Guinea to the beachheads, which we're going to talk about later, the Papuan beachheads.
Mm-hmm.
And we've done training exercises up there on the planning and the conditions under which they were fought, because who knows, it could well be an area of conflict in the future. So it's important to learn from the past. So I enjoy doing that as well. Yeah.
All right. Awesome. Now, when we're talking about, I mean, and maybe this is some stuff that you'll get into. I remember when we were on Guadalcanal, and we were all kind of sitting around talking about this stuff in the evening. We talked about how, at least from an American perspective, again, maybe an Australian too, Guadalcanal and New Guinea are kind of viewed as parallel campaigns that are happening at the same time. But the Japanese kind of view it all as one.
That's correct.
Campaign that's
absolutely on. Yeah, certainly on the Allied side, they were separate campaigns. They came under separate areas. The Guadalcanal campaign came under the South Pacific area, whereas the Papua New Guinea campaigns came under the Southwest Pacific area under General MacArthur. So they were separate in that regard. Whereas the Japanese, they came under the Japanese command in Rabaul.
Okay. Well, hey, if you...
That stage was 17th Army and also the 8th Fleet, which was the naval component.
Okay. Well, if you are a visual person like myself, Phil has brought an arsenal of maps and photos, and we're just going to kind of work through the New Guinea campaign and kind of get a view of it from 30,000 feet. So
let's go.
As we go along, if anybody has questions, we'll kind of try and pop them in, as we go. But Phil, go ahead and take it away. What do we got?
Okay, so what we're looking at here is a map of the area, and showing the Southwest Pacific area, South Pacific, Southwest Pacific area, and that's showing the lines of supply from the US mainland and from Hawaii down to Australia and New Zealand. And so this is very much a key area to control. And so the Japanese original plan, so the Japanese landed at Rabaul. If you look right in the center of the map, you'll see Rabaul is right up near the Bismarck Archipelago. And that's where they initially landed in January 1942. And from that base, they then moved out to both later move into Papua, and then also move down to Guadalcanal. And the original plan was actually to move right down. If you look right on the far right of the map, you'll see the Fiji Islands and the Samoa Islands. The original plan was called FS Plan, was to actually occupy the Fijian Islands and Samoa Islands. And you can see there how that would have cut off those supply routes and really isolated Australia and New Zealand, and probably made it very difficult for them to take such an active part in the coming battles. And it probably would have forced the American fleet back towards Hawaii to defend that area. So you can see Guadalcanal there in the center. So that's as far as they actually got at this stage. Now, there are a number of factors. The key factor, so they actually landed in New Guinea, on the mainland of New Guinea, on 8th of March, which is at Lae. So you can sort of see Lae yes, that's a good one to bring up. So you can see Lae there in the center of the map, where they landed on 8th of March. At the same time, they were landing in Bougainville, and then they moved down towards Guadalcanal by the beginning of July. And so, but we'll go back to May, because May was a critical point at which the Japanese original plan, they landed in Lae and Salamoa, and they just used those as air bases against Port Moresby. Port Moresby was the key to Papua. You can see Port Moresby at the bottom of the map there. And they sent a naval force, an amphibious naval force and merchant ships to invade Port Moresby, which was pretty well undefended at the time. There was just a few militia battalions in Port Moresby. But they were turned back. That force was turned back at the Battle of the Coral Sea, which took place 7th and 8th of May, 1942. So once that had occurred, the Japanese had to do a rethink of how they were going to secure Papua. So this is all part of their what they call the southern perimeter. So the idea wasn't to invade Australia at all. It was to create the southern perimeter from where they could hold off any Allied advance towards what they call the home islands. So the second part of the Japanese problem wasn't so much at Coral Sea, but then it occurred at Midway. So Midway occurred on the 4th of June, where they lost, as you know, 4 of their fleet carriers and a considerable amount of their naval force. And that caused them then to pull back from the idea of moving all the way to Fiji and Samoa. So what they would do they would base at Guadalcanal and then also on the New Guinea mainland, and that would be their southern perimeter at that stage. So on the 11th of July, the operation to capture the operation against Fiji and Samoa was cancelled. So that occurred on the 11th of July. And then only 10 days after that, on 21st of July, the Japanese made their first landings at, you can see there at the northern end of the Kokoda track, which went across from Gona, Buna and Girawa, went across to Port Moresby. So that's when the first landings in Papua occurred in the southern area there. That occurred on the 21st of July. And so, you remember at the same time they were landing at Guadalcanal. They'd landed at Guadalcanal on the 6th of July. So that just gives you a context there of how, and you can see there how Rabaul is central to all of this. So everything's coming from Rabaul, the movements to Guadalcanal and the movements into Papua as well. So it's part of one Japanese operation.
So you said from the Japanese point of view that an invasion, that like they're just forming a southern perimeter, but an invasion is not really on their radar at this point of Australia?
Not of Australia, no.
Wow. What were there? Do you know if there were like long-term plans to try and move to Australia, or
there weren't? There weren't at all.
Wow.
The point is, though, I guess, had the Coral Sea battle went another way, and they'd easily moved into Port Moresby, and had Midway gone another way, and they'd taken Midway and still had all their carriers, who's to know what would have happened after that? Because plans follow circumstance. So something may have happened after that, but it never came to that stage.
Okay. I'm guessing from the Australian perspective, though, I mean, you can look and see like the northern tip of Australia.
Absolutely.
Up there.
No, Australian was very concerned about the situation. Totally. And there were bombing raids on both Darwin, which is in the northern part of Australia, and Townsville, which is on the eastern coast, northeastern coast. So, yeah, there was certainly a threat to Australia. There were also in May 1942, there was a Japanese mini submarine raid in Sydney Harbour. Sydney Harbour is like there was a main naval port on the east coast. So there was very much a thought that they are coming south, but in fact they didn't have the plan at that stage to do so.
Okay. Well, hey, I'm already learning new things because I've always been under the impression that it was just kind of a natural progression that the Japanese were.
No, as I say, it could have progressed a bit like D-Day plans were never there at the start of the war, but they came later because of the situation. Same here, could have changed, but due to those naval defeats, there was no such consideration.
Okay, interesting.
So now we come to a closer look at Papua. So you'll see at the top of the map there in the red dots, that's the Kokoda, what's called the Kokoda Trail, or we call it the Kokoda Track, which went across from the north coast to Port Moresby. It's about 120 miles, and the mountains start at Kokoda. So from the coast up the Kokoda, so about half the length of the track is relatively easily traversed. But once you get to Kokoda, there's no such thing as a road, not even a proper track. It's real jungle and up and down ridges. So that's what the Japanese would take on. And I'll also point out there at the bottom right of Papua, you can see Milne Bay right at the bottom, and
Yes.
that would become quite a strategic location as well. And there will be a battle there, which we'll get into as well.
Okay. And as we're going along, there are people who are already buying your books.
Oh, that's super. That's always appreciated. And as I say, there's American viewers. There's a lot about the American contribution to the war in both of those books as well.
Awesome.
So now we look at a closer map of the Kokoda track or Kokoda Trail. So you can see at the top there, Kokoda at the top of the map there. As I said, the Japanese initially they just landed an advance party at the beachheads, and they sort of built up the beachheads, built up their supplies, and then headed off. But within a couple of days, their advance party had clashed. You can see on the top right there, the town, a small village called Awala, and that was the first clashes of the Japanese, actually with Papuan, what they call Papuan Infantry Battalion soldiers. So that occurred on 23rd of July, 1942. And today, the 23rd of July every year, is the PNG Remembrance Day, where they remember the people who were lost during the wars, and that's remembered on that day based on that clash. But at that stage, they only had small, very light forces, only a matter of a couple of platoons in the area. So they kept withdrawing back towards Kokoda, just giving back information that the Japanese were coming.
Okay.
I'll give you an idea of that. Give you an idea of the terrain. So as I said, once you reach Kokoda, then you've got the mountains, and you can see there how steep the rise is up to firstly Diniki, Isarava. So the first battles would take place in this area, and then up and down across creeks, up and down to the top of the range, which tops out in meters at 2,200 meters. So it's about 22. Well, what's that? Similar in yards. I think it's a tenth the difference. And then it drops down, but it's going down and up all the time. So you're always going down and up in the valley. So very defensible terrain. And to think you could advance across it with an army, or at this stage with 2 regiments plus an engineer regiment, is pretty ambitious. But the Japanese made a real fist of it. And I'll just talk a little bit about some of the battles. So as I said, the first battles actually took place at Kokoda. So by that stage, the Australians had managed to get part of a battalion across to Kokoda, and they tried to defend the Kokoda station, but there were too many Japanese there, so they only had 80 men at the time, and they pulled back. And Lieutenant Colonel William Owen, who was in charge of the battalion, the 39th Battalion, he was killed in action during that attack. And so then the Australians withdrew up into the mountains to Diniki. So the next clash occurred at Diniki. So that took place 2 weeks later. It took a while for the Japanese to gather their forces. So on 13th of August, the Japanese attacked at Diniki. And so the Australians were forced back to the next point, which was Isarava, which you'll see was the next point there.
Okay. So
by that stage, the main Japanese force still hadn't landed. So they didn't land till the 19th of August. So if we look at what was happening at Guadalcanal at the same time, at Guadalcanal, they were starting to get clashes on the, with the Marines in Guadalcanal. So now there's a stress on where you're going to send your forces. You're going to send them to Papua, or you're going to send them down to Guadalcanal. So it's not just the forces, but also the supplies, ammunition, food, all this. So everything is now affecting whatever's happening in Guadalcanal is also affecting what's now happening up here on the Owen Stanley Range.
So here's a question that popped up. Is there an airfield at Port Moresby or Kokoda where either one can be floating?
There's airfields at Port Moresby. In fact, there will be ultimately about 7 airfields at Port Moresby. It became the major Allied air base in the Southwest Pacific. So there's a major air base at Port Moresby. There was an airfield also at Kokoda, which was also important. So they were flying. They tried to fly units into Kokoda, but at this stage, the Japanese had landed on the coast. They'd set up an airfield on the coast, so they had air superiority in the area. So it was very dangerous to send over transport planes. So here you can see typical of the country. So this is taken at Kagi, which is a bit further on, which we'll come to soon. You can see where are we? Temple North, a fogey north. So if you look at a fogey north there in the middle of the map, this photo, Kagi is just across from that, across the valley to the right on that map, on that sketch. But again, back to that photo because it definitely shows the up and down nature of the country. So you can see how you travel along the spurs of the ridge, but then you drop down and come up again. So it's really, really tough going and very defensible. And at this stage, as I said, Isarava, the Japanese were well trained, certainly well trained. They attacked with two battalions at Isarava on 26th of August, and on 29th of August they captured the valley on the other side, and so they forced the Australians to pull back towards this area we're looking at now. So they pulled right back into the top of the range.
Okay.
And they thought they could hold the Japanese here, but again, the Japanese are fighting very cleverly, using a lot of outflanking movements through the jungle. They didn't always work, but in this particular case, they did. So further on from here, off to the left of the map, is a place called Brigade Hill, and the Australians actually held that with a full brigade, pretty much a full brigade. That's why it was called Brigade Hill.
Oh, okay.
And they were outflanked, and the Japanese got in behind them, and they had to pull back from that position as well. So the Japanese were really fighting very cleverly. Obviously, they would have had some local help to find the track to get around the back. But some big battles took place in this area.
Well, looking at this photo, it's easy for us to sit here and say, yeah, they outflanked them, but you just look at this terrain. Outflanking anybody anywhere is going to be a bear. It looks like. Extraordinary
to do it, and you have to find tracks that you can only get directed into, and you'd also have to be really strong troops to get up through that jungle. But it's hard to cover all your flanks as well. So there's advantages and disadvantages as being attacker and defender. It just depends on the quality of the troops and the command, and knowing the terrain. So at this stage, the Australians were still getting to grips with it. The Japanese were as well, but were probably at this stage a little bit ahead of the game, and their troops were still reasonably fresh, and they still had supplies. But that would change as the further they got away from their supply base.
Now, when we went to Guadalcanal, okay, so I'm American guy from the Midwest. I consider myself to be in reasonably good shape. The one thing that just really smacked me in the face when we got to Guadalcanal was that dadgum heat. It is unreal. So on Guadalcanal, you hear about a lot of heat casualties that the Marines are suffering, at the beginning. I'm assuming, because the terrain looks like it's even worse than anything in Guadalcanal.
Absolutely. But they're at higher altitudes, so the heat isn't as big an issue here.
Oh, okay.
It will become an issue when we talk about later battles down near the coast, but in this case, the heat is not the greatest issue. It's the terrain, without a doubt. Yeah.
Okay.
And getting supplies forward. Australians had the same problem, bringing supplies up from Port Moresby. They tried landing. They had drop zones actually at the top of the range where there was some open areas, but the Japanese overran them. And when they were using them as well, they were just dropping without parachutes. They didn't have parachutes. They were just dropping. They call them biscuit bombers, and so a lot of the stores weren't recovered or were damaged. So it was very difficult. Supply was a big issue here.
Is there any way of getting any light armor or artillery or anything like that up to them, or is it?
Well, certainly not light armor. The Australians decided they couldn't bring artillery into the position, but the Japanese did bring artillery. They brought what they call their mountain guns, which are they can break them down into loads, and they carried them all the way across the Kokoda track.
Oh my God!
And carried ammunition as well, and this gave them a big advantage in these battles, without question.
Wow.
Okay, so and these are 39th Battalion guys going over the track. So you can see the condition. So as you go over the track, because you do get a lot of rain up there, and the track's quite narrow, so it just soon just turns to mud. So you take 2 steps forward, 1 step back, going up these hills. And it's even hard today when you don't get so many people going across. But in those days, and of course, they just had, you can see there, those guys are wearing shorts. I mean, they're just not kitted out for the conditions. Also, their uniforms were khaki. They're sort of like a lighter color, lighter khaki color rather than a jungle green. And so they stood out in the jungle as well. So there are a lot of things they had to come to grips with to fight in this terrain. And obviously, the sheer physical exhaustion of carrying your stuff up these hills and down was really tested these men. There's a real credit to these men that they even could fight in these conditions.
Wow.
So that's a picture taken more recently going across the top of the range. As you can see there, it hasn't changed much, still quite muddy track. Also quite beautiful moving through the jungle. But you can just imagine the difficulty of fighting in these areas and how difficult it was to advance if the Japanese were or the Australians were, held positions at the side of the track. They had to be outflanked and such. So, really interesting terrain to fight a battle in. We come back to the map, and you can see. I think the best one is to go back to that cross section map.
Okay. There we go.
That's it. So at this stage, so they pushed the Australians off what we call Brigade Hill, which you can see there between Afogi and Manari. Then the Australians had to really pull back to the next defensible position was Iribara Ridge. And Iribara Ridge, you can see there just to the left of the Maguli Range. And that was the position they decided they would make their big stand at. So they had something like 2 brigades in there at that stage. So they had quite strong units. The Japanese were weakening as they went across. But believe it or not, the Japanese still managed to defeat them at Iribara Ridge and take that ridge. They managed to get a unit up onto a high position with machine gun and could enfilade the entire Australian position. So the Australians withdrew to their final position, which was Imita Ridge. And that's the last ridge before the approaches to Port Moresby. So that had to be held at all costs. So at that stage, they brought in another brigade. They'd also brought artillery up, which would fire. They'd got artillery into position. But at this stage, so I'm just talking about the dates now. So that Iribara Ridge fell on the 14th of September. Japanese were up there for about a week. And on the 23rd of September, the Japanese are ordered to withdraw back to the north coast. So they were pretty weak at that stage, and it's hard to say. They'd taken Iribara Ridge. Who's to say they couldn't crack into Imita Ridge, and then they'd be overlooking Port Moresby. So, but they were ordered to withdraw. So at that stage was the 23rd of September. We're going to get onto another battle after this one, which is the Battle of Milne Bay, which was taking place around this time as well, and that had been the Japanese had also been defeated there. So as far as Papua went, they decided, and because of what was happening on Guadalcanal, where the supply priority was now and reinforcement priority, they pulled back to what they call their northern beachheads. And so that's and they had delaying actions on the way back, but basically the campaign and the Australians had trouble pushing back over the track as well, because as they went back over the track, their supply lines are getting longer as well. Yeah. Until they captured Kokoda airfield, they still had to bring everything over by carrier, and here it was the local people, the native carriers, who did an amazing job for the Australians carrying those supplies over the track to back up the troops. Wow. So after they pulled back, then 2 Australian brigades, the 25th and 16th brigades, were sent across chasing them, but they took their time to get across, and it wasn't until November that they reached the other side and took Kokoda. But we'll come to that after we cover the Battle of Milne Bay. But basically, that's the story of the Kokoda campaign. It was Japanese got a lot further than they thought they would, and ultimately, the effect of the Guadalcanal campaign meant they didn't push any further, and they pulled back. It must be remembered at this time that you can imagine the ructions in Australian command, particularly with General MacArthur. He's planning to go back to the Philippines, and here he is. He can't even hold on to. In Port Moresby's actually threatened his main base north of Australia. So he was obviously demanding answers from the Australian commander. The Australian commander was General Blamey. So General Blamey, in succession, sacked the brigade commander who'd lost Brigade Hill, which was Brigadier Potts, and then next thing he he went for the commander of the New Guinea force, which was General Rao, and he had a bit of a record with him, but he sacked him as well, put in his own men. And then he also sacked the divisional commander, General Allen, and replaced him with General Vasey. So now he had, in those three key positions, the brigade commander, division commander, and New Guinea, what they call New Guinea force commander, were guys who were in his pocket, so to speak. So, and that would tell on the later actions and how they would go. But yeah, no, caused a lot of issues, Kokoda track campaign, and still does today. People will argue about it and how many Japanese forces. The forces in the initial engagement are actually pretty similar. Peter Williams has done a lot of work on this. His book's very good on this. I recommend that one as well. So, so we'll call it quits on the Kokoda campaign there and move on to the next stage. So as I say, Milne Bay is at the very eastern end of the Papua New Guinea mainland. At that stage, Papua, and you can see there it's a long bay, bay area, which makes it a very good anchorage, and also the air base has been built there because there was quite flat ground around the edges of that bay. So that stage there were 3 airstrips being built, 2 of which were in operation. The third one was just being cleared. The Australians at the time, contrary to what the Japanese thought, the Australians had 2 brigades. So brigades basically the same size as an American regiment, 3 battalions. So they actually had 6 battalions deployed, plus they had 8 guns from a field regiment battery. And there was also some US, there were about 1,300 US Army personnel in the area, mainly engineers. So they had a field company, the 24th Field Company. So they were building the airstrips and also doing a lot of the infrastructure work there around the port and such. But you can see there the disposition. So the Australians, they had basically intelligence that the Japanese were coming because they were reading their plans. So they deployed their units accordingly. So they had, so the 2 battalions, one's the 7th, the 2 brigades, one is the 7th Brigade and one is the 18th Brigade. The 18th Brigade is what they call an AIF Brigade. So it's higher quality soldiers who'd fought in the Middle East and come back to Australia to fight. And they had the better weapons, the better men and officers. The other battalion, so the AIF battalions had a 2 in front of their name from the following on from the First World War, which was the original ones. So the 2nd 12th, 2nd 9th, and 2nd 10th, you can see them deployed there. They were deployed in reserve while the militia battalions were deployed on the coast in defensive positions. You can see the 25th Battalion, the 9th Battalion, the 61st Battalion. Now, they also weren't sure if the Japanese would land on the north coast, so there was a platoon from the 61st Battalion and a company from the 25th Battalion deployed on the north coast. And in fact, the Japanese did land a force on the north coast as well and tried to come across the range, but they just didn't know what they were in for and never succeeded. So they're the deployments of the Australian battalions at the start of the battle. So the Japanese in this battle, they'd originally were going to deploy a battalion from the 124th Regiment. So that's a good aerial shot of Milne Bay. So you can see there the mountains rising up on the coastline. So this is mainly a coconut plantation area. You can see, and that's the head of the bay, and the airstrip's just off to the right. So the Japanese, because they had to send the forces to Guadalcanal. So this was part of Kawaguchi's regiment, one of the battalions. And then later there would also be one from the Aoba regiment, which was also designated to come to this area, but it also had to get diverted to Guadalcanal. So the only forces available to them would be naval forces from the 8th Fleet, which would be special naval landing parties. So remembering they're up against 2 brigades plus ancillary forces. So they deployed the 5th KURE, which is Kure, the 5th Kure naval landing party. So that's only 600 men, plus the 5th Sasebo landing party is 197 men. So basically they deployed 800 men to take on pretty much 6 times that figure. But you've got to remember, at this stage they had they were unchallenged in their naval. So if you go back to that slide before, actually,
yeah, sure.
that's it. So that shows part of the 61st Battalion, who are deployed there. Now, a couple of things to notice, as I pointed out in the Kokoda track campaign, the men are wearing shorts. This is a really malarial area here, really terrible place to be wearing shorts because you're going to get bitten by mosquitoes, and also going through the scrub, it's pretty hard on the legs. So
Yeah.
these men are basically equipped to fight in the deserts of North Africa, which is where the Australian Army was fighting up until that stage. And so here they are now in the Pacific. Another couple of features you'll see there. One is all these little creeks which run down from the mountains. Now, when it rains, and it rains pretty much every day there, these creeks get quite high and can be quite hard to cross.
Okay.
In the background, you can see the mountains. So you can see that it's only a narrow strip that is flat. And so the Japanese avenue of approach would be along this narrow strip. So if we go to the next slide. So this is the Australian dispositions in the area. This is 25th Battalion was going to be in the area where the Japanese planned to land. So this was the Japanese landing plan. So they had 2 merchant ships which were outfitted with, so the Japanese would just come down onto landing craft from those and land directly. So they were basically modified merchant ships. Okay. So their plan was to land at the head of the bay, and you can see the airfield, one of the airfields just north of there. Mm-hmm. So they plan to land there and take that area. But you can see every green dot there is an Australian Bren gun, which is a light machine gun position. So it's a light machine gun post, and every red dot is a Vickers gun, which is a heavier water-cooled belt-fed machine gun post. So if the Japanese had landed where they planned to land, and plus they had artillery, they had 4 artillery pieces zeroed in on targets along the coast. So they just had to call them in. Then they had 4 more ready for targets of opportunity. So they would have really hammered these units. There was only 800 men being landed, and then they had another 5. Australians had another 5 battalions to throw into the fray. So there's no way they would have achieved their aims if they'd landed where they planned to. But they didn't land where they planned to. So if we go to the next slide. I'll also need to mention the other big advantage the Australians had at Milne Bay is they had air support. So they had number of squadrons of they had a couple of squadrons of P-40 Kitty Hawks. Again, an American plane. Again, Australians can't fight in the air without. They did have their own aircraft, but they weren't able to match the Japanese aircraft. So they relied on the P-40 Kitty Hawk at this stage as their main fighter aircraft. And you can see the ground there, because it rains so much, the ground is very muddy. They've had to lay Marsden matting to taxi the aircraft along the strip. You can again see there how close the mountains are to the coast, and also how they've had to cut these strips out of the coconut plantations. Next slide. So Japanese landed. It was foggy that morning, and they thought they were landing at the head of the bay, but in fact they were about 10 miles further up the coast where they landed. You can see there. So this is so the Australian aircraft could basically take off and within 2 minutes be strafing the Japanese landing craft. So they sunk most of them. But this is the day after they landed. They landed at night, so they did get ashore. But of course, their supplies, and they brought all the fuel and everything for the aircraft because they thought they would take the airfields. But so this is a good picture of the aircraft strafing the Japanese positions.
So are the Japanese not trying to bomb the airfields and take out Australian air power first? Or are they trying to like preserve the airfield so that they can use it? Or
so any bombing would have to come from Rabaul or Lae, which were Lae was basically a staging post. At this stage, what bombing they did there was ineffective. The bigger advantage they possibly had was naval. The only naval forces they had were light cruisers. And again, they were pulling them out before daylight because they would be subject to attack. In fact, the Kitty Hawks tried to sink part of the convoy and they didn't succeed. So the Japanese did get ashore on the, so we're just talking dates here. So it was the night of the 25th of August. So this is the same time as the attacks are taking place along the Kokoda track. So they're basically hitting the Australian defences in Papua from two directions at this stage.
Gotcha.
The other thing you got to remember is the Australian command, even though the Japanese had landed now, they weren't sure if there was going to be another landing. So they couldn't commit all their forces to just this one landing. So they had the unit that was in position, which was the 61st Battalion. and part of them held up the Japanese for a while, and then they sent in one of the AIF battalions, the 2nd 10th Battalion, and they also held up the Japanese for a while. The Japanese had 2 light tanks with them, which would be knocked out further down the track, but the Japanese did reach the head of the bay, and they reached what was called number 3 airfield. Just go to the next slide. I think there's a map. No, go back again. Okay, so they've reached the head of the airfield. So this is number 3 airfield. This is the unfinished airfield. Now it's not a good drawing, but what it shows, it's a nighttime attack by the Japanese across the airfield.
Okay.
And this took place on the 31st of August. And the Japanese attacked across this. It's basically their killing ground. And the Australians not only had their own machine guns and mortars and riflemen, but the Americans had a anti-aircraft unit on the with 50 cal machine guns mounted in the back of half tracks. So you can imagine what effect they had on the Japanese attack. And the Japanese attack never got across the airfield. So this is basically where the Battle of Milne Bay was turned back. And then the Australians would push forward and throw the rest of the Japanese into the ocean. They did get some more reinforcements, some more naval landing parties came in. So they ended up with about, instead of 800 men, they ended up with about 2,000 men in the area, but they were pushed back. And ultimately, Milne Bay was secured.
Okay, and you said this is late August that this is happening.
This is happening 31st of August. The Japanese actually evacuated their landing place further up the coast on the night of 6th of September. So by the 6th of September, this battle was over. Okay.
So this is shortly after the Battle of Alligator Creek over on Guadalcanal.
Okay, there you go. So they tried to get reinforcements from the as I say, from the Kawaguchi regiment, the 1st Battalion. And this was just when the Achiki detachment was wiped out at Alligator Creek. Yeah. So instead they were sent there. So they didn't reinforce Milne Bay. So they've basically been unable to reinforce on the Kokoda track and also at Milne Bay. So it's a case of they're trying to fight 3 battles at this stage. Yeah. And so they've basically given up on Papua and said, well, Guadalcanal is more important to us. It was pretty clear that that's where their major resources were going. Because you've got to remember at the time, you talked about attacks on Milne Bay airfields. Most of the Betty bombers were sitting at the bottom of the slot down at Guadalcanal. They'd done long-range bombing attacks on Guadalcanal, which was they'd lost a lot of their bombers in that area. So, again, they're trying to spread what units they had over 3 battlefields, and in the end succeeded in none of them. So again, as you said, the effect of the Allied superiority. As I say, at this stage the Japanese still had good naval superiority in the area, so they were able to come in one night with, similar to what they did at Guadalcanal, where they brought a cruiser in at night and sunk one of the Australian supply ships at its moorings after they withdrew in first couple of weeks of September. So they still were strong in the Navy. So the Australian command still wasn't sure whether they'd come back to Milne Bay, so they had to leave troops there. But they had actually defeated the attempt of the Japanese to take Milne Bay.
All right.
So now we look at the next phase of the. Let's have a drink. Now we look at the next phase of the operation. So the Australians are advancing back across the Kokoda track, and you can see the Australian forces there with the blue lines in the north across the Kokoda track. And at this stage, the American 32nd Division had been sent up to Port Moresby as well. So the American 32nd Division were advancing. They sent a battalion across what they call the Kappa Kappa track, which is the southern route there you can see across the mountains. They only ever got one battalion across because the men arrived so exhausted and having to discard most of their supplies that they only got one battalion across. So the rest of them, they flew across. And this was one of the key things that the Americans had over the Japanese in this campaign, is that they could fly troops into these forward airfields across on the northern side of the Owen Stanley Ranges. You can see the Japanese beachheads there up in the north in the red area, which is basically covers Gona, Buna, and Sanananda, which are the battles we're going to talk about now. You can also see the Japanese, they tried to hold the Australians up around Kokoda, on either side of Kokoda, but the Australians were too manoeuvred too well for them, and so they suffered heavy defeats, and they had to pull back into the beachheads as well. And so that's going to be the next phase of the battle. At this stage, the Japanese wanted to hang on to this beachhead because they always thought, we'll come back when we get stronger again, and we'll have another go at Port Moresby. So this beachhead was still a big threat to the Allied plans, and so the orders went out to wipe out the Japanese beachheads. There were 3 of them at Gona, Buna, and Sanananda. This important spot, this is the Wairopi River, which is the big river, the Kamusi River, and it's called the Wairopi Bridge. So this is a bridge that the Australian engineers rigged up to cross this river. It's a hell of a river. It's always in full flood. Every time I go through there, it's wiped out bridges. There's a bridge over it today, but in the past, bridges that have been put over that river have washed away, even modern, well-constructed concrete bridges.
Yeah, you call this a bridge. I think we're using the term bridge very loosely here.
One hell of a river. Yeah, that's they did well to get across there, I can tell you. So that's Australian engineers rigged it up. So I just wanted to show you that as some of the conditions. We talked about the mountains and the valleys and the jungles, but also these major water courses cause big problems.
That is
and
awful.
In fact, the Japanese commander at the time, he was swept away in the retreat, and he ended up out at sea and drowned.
Oh my!
Swept out to sea further down. Yeah,
Holy
tried to cross on his horse. God knows what happened to his horse, but he didn't make it. Yeah.
Good grief! And we're looking at men going across, on these toothpicks. I mean, this isn't even trying to get like heavy gear across the river. That is wild.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so that's why the area is called Wairopi. It's a wire rope.
Oh, that is awful.
Yeah, and that's New Guinea. I mean, you've got to change your whole sort of perception of what's normal and what's not normal.
Yeah.
And also you've got to change as particularly engineers had to really think outside the box in terms of how they would operate in these areas. So we're talking now, we're into November. And so a big change happened in the Japanese command on this actually happened in November 1942. So previously the Japanese fleet, the Japanese 8th Fleet, operated with the 17th Army, but now the 17th Army would take over command. So you can see there, they were commanding the area in Guadalcanal, so it was now split up. It still came under the 8th Area Army, which was Lieutenant General Imamura. So he commanded the area army, but he had 2 armies under him. The 17th Army was the army that was now in the Solomon Islands. So as you know, Guadalcanal was just the start of that campaign. They then pulled back to other islands. So there were battles for places like New Georgia and Munda. There were other battles to take place in the Solomons and then up to Bougainville. So that would be the 17th Army. So there you can see the units that were allocated to the 17th Army, and then the 18th Army would be the army operating now in Papua and New Guinea, and that was the 18th Army. So again, they had the South Seas Detachment, which was still based around the 2 regiments, the 41st and 144th Regiment, and then they also had the 21st Independent Mixed Brigade. They also had it in the South Seas Detachment an engineering regiment as well. So and plus they had obviously air units as well. So just as I'm saying, the whole thing of Guadalcanal and Papua being the same campaign as far as the Japanese concerned, there you can see the confirmation. They both came under the same command of the 8th Area Army.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is the approach to the beachheads. So you can see the Allies are moving on 3 axes. So in the north, they're moving towards Gona, and that would be the 16th Brigade, the 16th Australian Brigade. In the centre, they're moving towards Sanananda, or as the Japanese called it, Gurua, and that would be at this stage, the 16th Brigade, Australian Brigade. And And then in the south, you can see they're moving up from further south where there's the Americans have been flown in the 32nd Division. So the 32nd Division, so this is at this stage, this is just a US operation. They had also the Australian 2nd 6th Independent Company as well with them, but mainly this was this American operation approaching Buna. And you can see there the approach to Buna. It's important to remember when we get into the fighting at Buna, there are actually two avenues of approach to Buna. You can see two avenues there because there's two separate fronts separated by massive swampy area and jungle area. So they actually had two approaches up the two tracks that led into Buna.
Right. So are the Japanese kind of intent on holding this?
Absolutely.
Is it? I mean, is it going to? If they don't hold it, is there a risk of the Allies coming in and kind of like outflanking Rabaul? Like what? Why is New Guinea so important to the Japanese?
New Guinea at this stage, Papua area is important to them for two reasons. One, they still want this perimeter away from, and they certainly want to keep them away from Rabaul.
Sure.
But they've still got plans to carry out that Kokoda track campaign again. They feel they've done it once. Why not again? Once we get strong again. So they were very determined to hold these areas. Most of the troops moving into these areas had time now to build defences. There were also engineers deployed who were building defences and using the local materials very well, particularly the logs from the coconut trees. Also, that we'll see later, the steel drums from the airfield from the gasoline. So they were using these in very innovative ways to create very strong bunker positions in these three areas. And the attacks basically had to be channeled in on small fronts because of the rivers, the swamps, the forests. There's all sorts of issues in terms of how to approach, let alone attack these positions. I'll go to the next slide. So there's three beachheads. So the first one I'm going to deal with was the one that's furthest to the west, which is Gona. But remembering all these beachheads are quite close together.
Okay.
So the approach to Gona. So as I said, the 25th Brigade, they actually reached Gona on the 21st of November. So they're and there you can see Gona and the Japanese positions. It's not. It's basically a small mission station, and they're defending it. As I said, they've built pretty strong defences, but it's not a big area. It's as we'll see when we show some photos later. But you can see the Australians. The initial approach was from the south, and they came in along that track from the south, and that was the 25th Brigade. They took heavy casualties. They tried to take it straight away and took very heavy casualties. It wasn't until they even once they got some artillery in, the artillery was short of ammunition. Now remember, all these battles are taking place at the same time, but we'll deal with them, as I said, sequentially. But they're all taking place at the same time. So meanwhile, we'll get on to Buna, but it needs to be remembered what was happening at Buna was the Americans weren't able to break the defences at Buna. So on the 25th of November, there was a big conference with General MacArthur. I believe this took place in Port Moresby. And General Blamey, the Australian commander, General MacArthur said, we can give you the, because they had one American division still to be deployed, which was the 41st. And he said, we'll give you a regiment from them. And Blamey told him, no, we prefer Australians because we know they'll fight. So that was a pretty harsh thing to say to MacArthur, but at that stage it was true. Americans had only, and we'll talk about it more about Buna, but at that stage the Americans are really struggling to adapt to this terrain. So here we can see a view of Gona. If you see just at the top there, there's like a wharf. It's not really a wharf. It's like a wall. It's where the creek comes out. So that's Gona in there. So the front line was basically from the bottom of the photo, which is, you can see a small creek on the left there, just above the bottom of the photo, was basically from that point up to that point. So it's less than a mile. It's less than a mile distance, probably half a mile. So it's an incredibly small area to fight over. And inland, it was, again, about the same distance. So it was a very small beachhead. And as I say, they'd failed to take it directly. So then the 21st Brigade, so these are the troops that had fought across the Kokoda track, across the Kokoda Trail, and they were also they were quite weak. They were down to a couple of companies in a battalion, about half strength or less, and they were flowing into Poppin. So now they could fly troops across, and so they flew across on the 25th of November, and then on the 28th of November they reached the front line, and the commander, who was the same commander who General Blamey had put into command over the other commander, General Brigadier Potts, who'd been relieved of command on the Kokoda track. Doherty was told you have to attack the next day without any reconnaissance, planning, any support. Practically, they were to attack, and they were attacked from the bottom of this position straight up along the coast. One of the reasons I'm interested in this campaign is my father's battalion was one of the units involved.
Oh, wow.
He wasn't with them then. He was in Port Moresby. He would come across as a reinforcement after their losses here.
Okay.
So the first, just go back again.
Yeah, sure.
The first clash occurred at this creek of this new attack. So the 2nd 14th Battalion, which was one of the battalions that come in, and they were told this area around Small Creek was there were no Japanese, and they ran into a Japanese at night as they tried to get in, and they lost a number of men. So that was the first action. And then the next day, they would go forward from here. They were ordered to attack straight up towards the top of the picture. And the Japanese had dug in, and a lot of their positions were underneath trees, so they couldn't be hit by shell fire or mortar fire or anything like that, and they couldn't be seen. And a lot of the Japanese were also up the trees. And so they went in to 2 companies. And one of the guys I interviewed who was in the attack, he just called it a murderous curtain of lead. So they just got hit. They just got hit and stopped. One of the guys I knew is a platoon commander, Bob Johns. His Bren gunner and the number 2 of the Bren gunner were hit and killed in action. Bob Johns went across to get the gun, and then he told me, he said it was slam. It was like being hit by a barn door. So he was shot. He was wounded. He was shot through the shoulder, but then the bullet went through his shoulder, and his Batman, his assistant, was behind him, and he was killed by that same bullet. So,
wow.
The two company, one of the company commanders and his second in command was killed. Altogether, they lost 14 men killed and 41 wounded in that attack. That was my dad's battalion, just 2 companies. So you can see how tough the Japanese were going to fight for these areas and how tough it was going to be. It wasn't just a matter of attacking and hoping for the best. There would have to be coordinated attacks and properly attacks done. So the next day, the next company went, they attacked as well. And again, I knew one of the men involved, Bert Ward, and he just said as soon as they came out of the trees, they hit a wall of fire. So they lost 13 more men. 1st of December, another of the units, the 2nd 16th Battalion, attacked. They took 59 casualties. The New Guinea Force commander, who was overseeing the operation, again, one of Blamey's appointments, he reported to Blamey that my dad's battalion at the time, he said they were slightly shaken by the resistance. Slightly shaken, they were almost wiped out. So it was getting tough. There were also attacks. There was also Australians deployed on the further north. So the Japanese were trying to land troops further north to reinforce Gona, and they had to hold them off as well. I won't go into too much detail with it. Meanwhile, they tried to attack also. Sorry, they tried to come in from the left-hand side of that picture as well, and those attacks had failed as well. If you want to go to the next picture, the next slide. Sure. I'll just try to sort this out. There we go. So this shows the sort of country now they're advancing over kunai, what they call kunai grass, which is, now this is really hot. You talked about the heat in Guadalcanal. This is bad. You can see these guys, and also they're not eating a lot. They're pretty skinny, and they're just fighting in this kunai country and trying to stay alive. And it's open. The sun's on them. Now have a look at the angle on that mortar. It's basically firing vertically, and that's how close the Japanese lines were to the Australian positions. So when we take army units there today, we go over this next attack, which was a successful one. We take them to the same ground and ask them what would they do. And so what happened in the end, if we go to the next slide, where are we? Go back. Yeah, it's okay. That's for the next attack.
Okay.
They finally broke in. They actually coordinated the use of artillery. The commander, he'd been the commander of one of the battalions, the 39th Battalion. They'd fought well on the Kokoda track, and they now brought them in here. They were much weakened, but he knew two things. He knew how to disobey orders to attack a certain way, and he planned it. He planned his artillery really cleverly, that he would have his troops advance right on the heels of the artillery. He told the artillery to fire a minute longer than they should have, and he didn't tell the attackers. Meanwhile, the attackers said, we'll start a minute early. So there was actually 2 minutes. So they got hit while they were coming over. They lost a few men to the artillery, but they managed to take the Japanese positions. And when they moved in, the Japanese were still in their foxholes with their heads under their hands, sheltering from the artillery. So they were basically using the same tactics they perfected in the First World War, and that is advance right in behind the artillery. And so Gona finally fell on the 8th, 9th of December, and the Japanese tried to break out, pretty much killed out. So they found something like 650 men dead in the area.
Wow.
So as I said, Gona was the first of the beachheads to fall. So we'll move on to Buna now. We still okay with time there, JD?
Oh yeah, we got all the time in the world.
Okay, so this is, as I said about the advance on Buna. So Buna's on the right there, Sanananda's on the left. We're going to deal with Sanananda after this. But remember, all these battles are taking place at the same time. Gona is off to the left of that map, and that's already fallen. So now they're attacking Buna. And you can see there, it's quite a small beachhead. So in length, if you look at that, about 3 miles along the coast, but it's only very shallow. But all this area is really heavily fortified with Japanese bunkers. And so they've covered all the main lines of approaches. The Americans had moved in, first contact on 16th of November, and they'd been stopped cold. At this stage, they had three battalions employed on what they called the Warren Front, which is the front to the right, attacking up from the right-hand side or up the coast. And they had another 2 battalions attacking up the road called the Ango Road in the centre there. And they'd been stopped dead as well. So both attacked. So they were pretty much sitting there then, and every attack was difficult. And part of that was on the 18th of November, the Japanese actually brought in a battalion, a fresh battalion, army battalion, the 3rd 229th, came in from Rabaul overnight, and they landed at Buna. And they took over those positions just north of New Strip, and that made it very, very difficult position to break.
Okay. Yeah, because the Japanese who were in this area were in a pretty bad shape at this point, like as far as like getting resupplied and getting food and everything like that, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, they were in real bad shape. But as I said, they brought in a fresh battalion, which made a lot of difference. And with that as well, they would have brought in some sort of supplies as well. But as I said, the Japanese are very determined to take the position. It's one thing Peter Williams said the other day about that Bill Slim had said about that a lot of armies are told they fight to the death, but the one that really did it was the Japanese.
Yeah.
And they were willing to do it here as well. If you go to the next slide, just want to show you some pictures of the conditions. So these are American troops advancing up towards the front. So this is even before they've reached the front. So they've got to cross creeks on logs. They've got to go through the jungle. So you can just imagine the difficulties just getting into position to make attacks, let alone carry them out. So by the time they've reached the front, they're already much weakened. And one of the problems at this stage, Americans were surviving on, I think it was like 1,000 calories a day or something, some crazy figure. That was all the supplies they could get in there. And most of the supplies came up on little boats, which they managed to come up the coast. There was no major. The Navy certainly wasn't involved much because the area hadn't been charted, the area around the coast, and there were like coastal shoals and reefs, and they were very worried about losing vessels. So any vessels that came up had to be come up well south of their Oro Bay, or they had to fly the stuff in, and they were still getting the airfields right. But from there they had to walk it up to the front. So hell of a job.
Oh, yeah. My goodness, just look at
You can
that.
see the help. You can see the help the local carriers gave too. The local
Yeah.
carriers were invaluable, helping to carry some of the supplies forward.
Wow. So for the locals, is there a lot of cooperation with the Japanese while they're there, or are they pretty much
No, the
hostile to the
Japanese were quite brutal.
Okay.
And the Japanese did bring over some local people from Rabaul to help them. Basically, pretty much any locals employed by them would the first opportunity they got would go bush and get away from them.
Okay. All right. Yeah, boy, that picture is something else. We were looking for the one log bridge location over on
There you go.
Guadalcanal. We were on the wrong island. It was right here.
There you go. There's a one log bridge right there. And as I say, the key to this whole campaign was the aircraft, the C-47s or DC-3s, as they were known. The American transport squadrons were absolutely invaluable in pursuing this campaign. So there you can see a full unit of men. They carry about 18 men per plane. They're flying across the range. Imagine if they had to walk.
Yeah.
The other thing is the engineers. Here they are building up Dobadura. So there was a really good airfield area that they'd identified, which they would build up into a major airbase later on with about 7 airfields. And here they are constructing one of them using the PSP, the pierced steel planking or Marsden matting, as they called it, to help create the airfields. But they had to, first of all, they had to level the airfield, fill holes, everything. So these engineers were doing an amazing job, right. and the campaign couldn't have been prosecuted without them. There's no question of that. So that needs to be remembered. We talk about the fighting at the front, but what was going on behind the front was just as important.
Exactly.
So this is on the. We're not going to talk much about the Urbana front, but the Urbana front was the one coming straight up that road from the south into Buna, and you can see the conditions there. They're basically swamps. So they're crossing swamps and jungle. There's just no way. So even a company of men can hold up the entire advance. So that's what they were running into as they got close to Buna. That's one of the bridges connecting what's called the island, which is part of Old Buna.
This campaign is just one sketchy bridge after another.
Absolutely. and it needs to be understood because it's easy to get involved. Yeah, go to the next guy. You go to the next man. So I want to talk a little bit about this guy.
Sure.
Is Herman Botcher. So he's one of the 32nd Division guys. So he was in this advance coming up from the south, which had run into swamps and such. So on 5th of December, he took 18 men through the swamps. So he'd fought, he was actually of German descent. He wasn't even, I don't think he was an American citizen at that stage.
Oh,
he was in the American Army. And he had experience. He had fought in the Spanish Civil War. And so he sort of knew fighting. So he took 18 men through to the coast, through the swamps, got around the back of the Japanese and established a machine gun position on the coast with 18 men. And they held out for 17 days, just basically cutting the Japanese positions in two. But it was just one man and one section. But that's the sort of people that made a difference, but there unfortunately weren't enough of them. But he was later commissioned, and then he was killed in the Philippines campaign later in the war.
Wow.
But really one of the really brave American soldiers, Herman Botcher. Yeah.
Yeah. Looks like the grooming standards on New Guinea were suspended for a while.
Yeah. Well, as you say, this was taken at Buna just after the battle, and you can see there he's not eating real well, and probably got the arse out of his pants, and he's just got that 1,000-yard stare going. Somehow survived, but real proud moment of what they did. Got through to the coast and held this little position held off the Japanese for basically 17 days. Yeah.
Wow.
So now we're going to go back to what's called Warren Front, which was the main front where most of the attacks were taking place. So up until mid-December, as I say, the Americans were doing it all on their own without any tank support and with very little artillery support. They hadn't brought forward their own artillery. They were using Australian artillery support pretty much. And it wasn't until the 16th of December that the 18th Australian Brigade. These were the guys who had thrown the Japanese back into the sea at Milne Bay. So they came forward from Milne Bay to take part in this campaign. So the first of the battalions was the 2nd 9th Battalion, the Queensland Battalion. So they came in on the 16th of December. They actually did a 30-kilometre march, so about 20 miles. They marched up the coast to get in position. Then they were told to attack the next day.
Oh,
and they said, we will not. Because MacArthur, you can imagine at this stage, he's pulling his hair out.
Yeah.
And one of the things he said, time is working desperately against us. And he was right, because he knew the Japanese had reinforced the position and they could send more troops in, and make it impossible to take. So they got a day's delay, and then they made this attack on the morning of 18th of December with the 4 companies attacking up the coast. They had the support of about 6 Stuart tanks, which is a light tank. It's the same tank we saw on Guadalcanal. Remember, where just near Alligator Creek we saw it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so they used the same tanks here, just a small light tank, but made a lot of difference because they were impervious to the small arms fire. Previously, they'd tried Bren gun carriers, which are open at the top, and of course they just got smashed. So this attack went in on the 18th of December, and despite heavy losses across the companies, they lost a couple of hundred men, but they made the final breakthrough. And if we go to the next slide, and part of it was working with the tanks to break down these bunkers. Okay. So there you can see the place today. So at the bottom of the picture is basically the start line of that attack. Okay. And at the top of the picture is Cape Enderdare, which they took that day. And then inland, it gets this kunai grass. But all through this area were bunkers. So they had to break through this area. And then they would push up to the creek, which is further up on the left-hand side of the photo, to take this area. But that was done by the 2nd 9th Battalion with the American battalions by that stage were quite weakened, but they would support on the flanks as well and also help with evacuation of casualties. So that was the first major breakthrough into the Japanese position, and that took place on 18th of December by the Australian 18th Brigade.
And when you're talking about kunai grass, for people who haven't been to it, I'm going to show some of these little kunai grass areas in a later episode.
Okay.
But attacking through it, I can't even imagine, because your visibility is about 16 inches in front of your face.
Yeah, so the Japanese had cut fire lanes, so they knew as soon as they went into the open area, that was it. They were going to get cut by the fire lanes. So the kunai grass, and also it would catch fire because it was quite dry. So during a battle, you could get burnt out. So
wow,
it had all sorts of, we'll come back some other time and talk about campaigns later in the war in New Guinea where they had to advance through kunai grass, and it was like having a blanket thrown over you because it's hot enough normally, but you go into kunai grass, it's about 10 degrees hotter in there because there's no breeze, and it's just brutal. So yeah, kunai grass is a big one of the big terrain features in New Guinea that needs to be understood.
Wow.
So we'll talk about the bunkers a bit. So this is one of the bunkers captured during that attack, and you can see there a couple of things. One is how hard it is to see. So they'd been planted for a while, and they planted vegetation around them, so they looked like just part of the jungle. So you could almost be on top of it before you knew it was there, and you just wouldn't see them. And so even with the tank, it was very hard to destroy these bunkers. And later they developed, they used what they call like a blast bomb, like a satchel charge, which they could throw in rather than just a grenade to blow because they had separate rooms in some of them, so you couldn't just hit them with a grenade. You had to blast them. But you can see what the American guy there just looking over this bunker. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if it was something that has to do with the way that the Japanese were trained or whatever, but I've just in the limited experience that I've had in the Pacific, the way that the Japanese were able to camouflage their bunkers is so impressive. You go to Europe, you look at a German bunker, all right, it's this big concrete behemoth that you can't hide. But like when I was in Guam, I went to one of the coastal bunkers that the Japanese made.
Yeah.
And after I found it, like I knew right where it was at, and I stepped back 25, 30 yards, and legitimately, I couldn't see it anymore, even though I was looking right at it. Just it was so well built and so well camouflaged.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, this is amazing. You would never know that you were walking up on this thing.
Yeah, exactly. And there were 50, 60 of these in that little area. I mean, it
Oh
was
my
just
gosh.
all interlocking. So, as I say, what the Australians worked out, they developed their tactics as they went, but they would use a tank with like a section of infantry, and they would use the 6-pounder gun, which is the main gun on the tank, to open a hole, and then the guys would go forward under cover and then throw a grenade in. And as I say, in the later battles, which we'll get to, which happened a couple of weeks later, they actually developed what they call a blast bomb, which is a grenade attached to a tin of amytol. So amytol is quite a high explosive.
Yeah.
And then they would use that to detonate it, throw that in, and it would blast out the bunker. Rather than at this stage, they didn't have flamethrower available, but they would also use them later. And I mean, you've seen photos of Iwo Jima, Okinawa,
Sure.
Peleliu, some of these places where the Japanese had very similar constructions, and yeah, they were hard to knock out.
Wow.
That's inside one, so you can see there the nature of how they were constructed. So you can see there the what you would call 45-gallon drums. So the 45-gallon drums, they would fill them with earth. So you've got to remember the water table in this area is quite high. So they didn't dig them into the ground; they were above ground. But you can see there they made the walls with the 44-gallon drums filled with earth. Then they would lay over that what they call stringers, which are the long poles, the long coconut logs, and then over the top going the other way, they would put another layer. Then they would put the earth on top and then plant stuff on top of that. So they're really hard, even with a pinpoint artillery round, really hard to knock out. And they certainly didn't have pinpoint artillery attack at that stage. So they were pretty impervious. And then the entrance would be sealed pretty much once they got inside if there was a battle. So you couldn't see the entrance, and then the embrasure to fire out of was also very narrow. A lot of these bunkers also, they were just the Japanese were sheltering them during the bombardment. Then they would come out into the trenches or go up the trees and fire from there. So, which was a similar tactic to how the Germans used their bunkers, like in the First World War. They were actually sheltering from bombardments and then come out to fight so they could see. So there were always crawl trenches next to these bunkers and such. So. Yeah, they're pretty fearsome objective.
Wow. Oh, look at
And
that.
there's one today. So that's very similar to that design. You can see there the entrance on the right, and there's another entrance on the left there as well coming in. This is actually on the airfield, just at the end of the airfield. So this would have been a shelter bunker. But the drums are still there today, and you can see exactly how they would have designed it. Obviously, the logs over the top have long since deteriorated. But we had this dug out, especially for our when we take the army officers up there, because they get to see exactly how they were operated, and then we give them basically a task of how would you knock this out, sort of thing. So,
wow.
But yeah, that's very much shows the Kunai grass area as well. But yeah, that's a good example today. That's at Buna. Cool. So there's still bunkers there at Buna.
I love that.
That's probably the best of them. That's probably the best of them. Okay. So this is the second series of attacks. So in that first series of attacks, the Australian 2nd 9th Battalion has taken that area on the right-hand side of that map. And now they're attacking. They've crossed the creek at the bottom. Americans have put a bridge over that, and they're going to next attack up the old airstrip. So this is a cleared area, just kunai grass, because the airstrip hasn't been used for a while. It's been knocked out. But they're attacking against not just bunkers, but also anti-aircraft guns, which are on that airfield, which are still operating and can operate in a dual role. So, the morning of the attack is the 24th of December, and they'll send 4 Stuart tanks in with the attack, and behind them they will advance the infantry. So they will go in. And they will advance about 250 meters, and then they got hit by those Japanese 3-inch guns off to the left there. They smashed the tanks down at about 400 meters range, firing basically horizontally, open sights pretty much across the kunai, so they couldn't miss. And you'll see that in the next photo.
Wow. I just want to reinforce something real quick before we move on. We go back and look at this bunker
Yeah.
and then go back and look at all of those little gray squares and rectangles in there that
Yeah.
represent the bunkers. That is insane.
Yeah. In fact, there's more in the first attack, but there's still a lot around now. And
Wow.
that one we're looking at is just at the bottom of the photo there. One of those. It's still there
Wow.
today. So this photo was taken of the morning of the attack. So you can see the infantry in the kunai grass, getting ready to advance behind the tank, and that tank is going forward, and it's one of the tanks, the 4 tanks in the initial attack along the airstrip. So you can see there's not much cover there, and
Right.
so if there's an anti-tank gun up there, they're going to be in trouble. So they knew there were anti-aircraft guns on that airfield, but they'd done air attacks on the airfield and hadn't been fired at, so they figured they weren't working. But the Japanese were clever. They hadn't fired on the aircraft. They were waiting for the ground attack. Next slide. And that shows the effect. That is one of the tanks that was knocked out in that attack. That's Jack Lattimore's Stuart tank. And you can see where a 75 millimeter shell, 3-inch gun, has gone straight into the front of that tank and killed the driver.
Oh my gosh.
And Jack Lattimore lost his legs.
This is on display in Buna?
That's on display today in the USA, in the Nimitz Museum.
Oh.
The Nimitz Museum at Fredericksburg in Texas. And I can recommend to go to that museum, and you can hear Jack Lattimore's story. They play it on an audio loop when I was there anyway. That's a few years back now. But you can see there where the shell has gone straight into that tank and knocked it out. And not only one tank was knocked out, the 4 tanks were all knocked out by these Japanese guns.
Wow.
And one of those guns is still there today on the battlefield.
Look at that.
So it's actually a British design. It's a naval gun. It's a 3-inch naval gun designed to be either fire an aircraft or against shipping or a land target. So it was emplaced on the airfield and it's still there today. One of the other ones, there was a battery of them. There were 3 or 4. And one of them is actually also at the Nimitz Museum. You can see one of them there as well from that battle. So
that is cool as heck.
So once they lost their, we'll go back to that one. Because this is the next attack. Anyway, once they've lost their tanks, they then had a really tough job attacking forward across that open ground, and they actually went. They went around through the creek. There's a creek that runs along the side of the airstrip, and they advanced sort of along there to the airstrip, and then attacked across the airstrip. That 3-inch gun, that would also fire at the infantry. And when they run out of, and they would actually fire blanks into the kunai grass to set the kunai grass on fire. So you can imagine the difficulty they had attacking. So the Australian guys who actually took this position, there were American guys on the left flank, but it's all very swampy there. And so they couldn't get around, but they tried to get around the flank as well. But the attack had to go in across the airstrip, this open area of kunai grass against these positions. And Japanese also had 25 millimeter anti-aircraft cannon, which could fire in a horizontal roll against infantry. They were like a meat chopper type thing. And so they were also had to go in against them. The only way they took these positions in the end is they brought up an Australian gun at night and put it into one of the Japanese bunkers down the end of the airstrip, camouflaged it, and they fired it. They had an observer up a tree, and they could fire it straight into the Japanese bunkers at close range. And that's how they finally got. So they lost their direct fire support with the tanks. So what did they thought outside the box and brought this 25-pounder gun forward. They had to take it apart, take it across creeks and get it in position, and then they could fire directly, because there's no way you're going to take these positions without direct fire support.
Wow.
I guess these days you might have, helicopter support, or as Ghost of Sickles talks about, you can have a bazooka type operation. But at that stage, they didn't have bazookas in that area. So that's how you might do it today. But certainly once you lost your tanks, you're looking for some sort of other way of direct fire support.
Okay.
This is the third phase of the operation. So once they took the end of the airstrip, they then attacked at right angles to the coast. And this was taken during that attack. Again, they're up against these bunkers. They're operating with the tanks. You can see there the tank. Next to the tank is a 2-inch mortar section. They're firing a small mortar in advance of the tank. And obviously, we've got the Bren gunners supporting, firing from the hip and from what positions they can get in the coconut plantations. And it was this attack. They had 6 Stuart tanks in this attack. They also had 6 Vickers machine guns in place further back, which they sprayed the top of these trees to kill any snipers, and then they would just pound the area until they got through. But again, they lost a lot of men. And one of the bravest guys that day was the guy who took this photograph, which is a guy called George Silk, a New Zealand guy who later worked in America as a sports photographer in America as well. But he was brave enough to take these photos that day as the men were under fire. But they attacked what they call a line after line of pillboxes, and basically, again, lost very heavily, but pushed through to the coast. They lost 50 men killed and 127 wounded that day and the next day, but they finally pushed through the coast, and Buna was taken. Yeah, that's the final attack.
Wow.
So the third keeps going. The third of the battles was Sanananda. So Sanananda so Buna fell on basically 2nd of January 1943. At that stage, the Japanese still held Sanananda. So in the center there, you can see there's what they call a Sanananda track. So it went from the south up to the top, and pretty much on either side is swamp. So pretty much you have to advance up the road. It's the only sort of firm ground in the area. And the Japanese had built a very strong bunker system, like an egg, further down the track. And they took, they were there for basically months before they could throw them out. Americans were deployed here, the 3rd 126th Regiment, 3rd Battalion 126th Regiment, under a guy called Meredith Huggins. They went around through the swamp and set up what they call Huggins Perimeter. You can see in the center there. So they tried to block the Japanese supply route to their main position further south. So the Australian attacks there had taken heavy casualties and hadn't been successful. But even once they cut the road, the Japanese were still getting supplies in overnight through the swamps. They were tracked through the swamps and such. So the Australians then sent another unit forward, the 2nd 7th Cavalry Regiment. And again, they pushed out a bit, but again ran into Japanese resistance. So this was a really tough attack. Japanese fought very strongly. And it wasn't until late in January, the 12th of January, that the 18th Brigade, who'd won at Milne Bay, they'd taken Buna, and now they were sent into Sanananda to finish that. And they were now down to bare bones. And these are some of the men advancing through the swamp. So you can see the conditions. And this is Sanananda. It's the same today, particularly at this time of year. Usually you go there in the dry season, but this is the wet season. And as Peter Brune called it, Peter Brune's an Australian author who wrote a great book called A Bastard of a Place. And they were talking about this place. Sanananda was a bastard of a place.
Mm. I'm just thinking about how hard it would be to take care of your feet in conditions
incredible.
like this.
Well, you just go on, don't you, and worry about it later. So they finally only got through by going through the swamps. Pretty much, that's how you had to get through. They tried to send tanks up the road; they got destroyed. But yeah, pretty much in the end, they went through. They could only go through with your feet through the swamps.
Wow!
And at night, they would sleep in the trees to keep out of the water.
Oh my gosh! Probably no mosquito net or anything either.
So by now the Americans had sent in the 41st Division, part of the 41st Division, and these are American troops. They're advancing from Buna towards Sanananda, and that shot is taken just inland from the beach. Set up a 30 cal on the road there. So that was taken under fire as well. So the Americans also, some of them fought very, very bravely as well in this phase of the attack to finish this battle. But it was a brutal place to fight, and Sanananda finally fell around the end of January. So about the same time as they decided to pull out of Guadalcanal, this battle was also ending. And that's part of the result. That is the 41st Division Cemetery at Saputa, which is just inland from the coast, and that's where they buried their dead. And this has taken about 6 months later when they've gone and visited their buddies to put flowers on their graves. So you've got to remember all these battles. A lot of men didn't come home. And, of course, they were all later, all American graves in PNG were later, they were either reburied in Manila, which is a major American cemetery, or they were repatriated to their home in USA and buried there. So I want to talk a little bit about General Eichelberger, who was the American general who was sent in to take control of Buna, the Battle for Buna, who did a good job keeping his troops going, certainly helped by the Australians who'd come in with the tanks as well. But he said after the campaign, he said, "One can't imagine a more unfriendly country or worse conditions to fight in. The whole campaign was a military nightmare." And yeah, that's where it ended at the end of January 1943.
And even the Japanese had their own perspective on New Guinea as well. Of all the places that they thought, they had a kind of a dark saying about the people who were sent there.
Yeah, so the saying they had was Java is heaven. So this is where they were deployed. Java is heaven, Burma is hell, but you never come back alive from New Guinea. And that was pretty true throughout one day we'll talk about later campaigns, but throughout the war in New Guinea, there was something like 120,000 Japanese troops sent there, and probably less than 10% of those got back to Japan.
Wow. Now, I'll have to have you back on at some point, and maybe we'll talk about some later campaigns. The island hopping campaign continues, but like there's sustained combat on New Guinea, like for the duration of the war, isn't there?
Absolutely. Yeah, it went right on to the end of the war. So quick snapshot, by April 1944, so we're going now forward a couple of years. By then they'd built, at least a year, they built up their air and naval force. So they built up an amphibious force. So it wasn't until April 1944 that the American made a landing at Hollandia, modern-day Jayapura in Indonesia. So that's outside of New Guinea. And that was the big step heading towards the Philippines. And at that stage, basically New Guinea was isolated. All the American troops were pulled out of New Guinea and sent north for the Philippine campaign, and the campaign up through Biak and some of the islands to get up to the Philippines. And so the Australians took over control in both Bougainville, New Britain, and on New Guinea, and they would fight till the end of the war. The Japanese stayed there, supplied at parts by submarine, but mainly supplied by growing their own food in gardens. Half of the Japanese garrisons at that stage were gardeners to keep enough food to. And of course they never attacked Rabaul. They just isolated Rabaul, and so that you had like considerable Japanese troops, probably 100,000 men up in Rabaul. So again, they turned into gardeners just to get enough food to survive.
Wow, it's wild to think, because again, from an American perspective, we think island hopping campaign. So you go to Peleliu and you go to the Philippines, and there's Iwo Jima and Okinawa and Saipan. Okay, so there's a lot of movement towards Japan, but man, there's this tough nut to crack that the Japanese just hold on to throughout the entire thing, which shows just how difficult New Guinea was.
Oh, totally. So I'll just show you the final. You've seen as I say, that's the book on the whole campaign, Hell's Battlefield.
Yes.
That's the book you have that we talked about, which is
D-Day New Guinea.
That's it, D-Day New Guinea. And the other one, I'll just grab.
Yeah, sure. So while he's grabbing that book, I would encourage everybody watching to go out and pick up these books and support his work, because it's really, really good stuff.
That's the other one.
Shaggy Ridge.
Battle for Shaggy Ridge. Just incredible terrain. If you want to learn about terrain fighting, it's all there.
Oh, look at that!
Some color photos as well. just the ridges. We'll talk about this one day, but just
Yeah.
the condition.
Yeah, we'll have to get you back on to talk about
fighting,
Jagged Ridge and some of these later campaigns.
Sure.
All right, cool. Well, hey, before you go, what you got? Anything that you're working on currently?
Yeah, I've gone back in time. I've gone back to the First World War. So I'm currently writing a book on the Australians in the First World War on the Western Front. It'll be called Inferno, and it'll be out at the end of the year. So it'll be out in November, and awesome. It's basically covers all the Australian actions. But it's not my story; it's the story of the men. So there were so many diaries, letters, memoirs, books written after the war by Australians, and it basically combines all their experiences of the different battles in the air, underground, everywhere, just what they went through. So it's their story. So it's just, all I do is put it in the context, put it into its time frame, and let the guys tell the story. And you think World War II was tough, and I mean, what these guys in World War I went through as well is just horrendous. And I think I decided with the publisher on the name of the book, Inferno, and it's well titled. It's exactly what these men went into.
Yeah, and that's coming out later this year.
Yeah, it'll be out in November. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm definitely looking forward to it. All right.
Okay.
Well, hey man, thanks for jumping on here and chatting with us a little bit on the New Guinea campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, JD. Appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. All right, so there you go. There's a little bit on New Guinea. Again, you look at these different campaigns. The men who are fighting on Guadalcanal and the men who are fighting on New Guinea have no. I mean, they can only see what's right in front of them. Have no idea that what they're doing is supporting each other. And yeah, historians like Phil do a good job at helping to bring these stories to life and to help give us a broader view of what was happening during the war. So anyway, thanks for jumping on and joining us this evening. And yeah, be watching out for the next episode in the Guadalcanal series. Probably coming out on Sunday. Going to be looking at the Barcelona position. All right, good evening.